Okay, so looking at our case study, we chose the Second Congo War. This war was fought between Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and the Congolese rebels on the one side, on the left. There's no flag for the Congolese rebels. And then the DRC, Angola, Chad, Libya, Zimbabwe, and Sudan on the other. I think that's all of them. It ran officially from August 1998 to July 2003, though unofficially the conflict went for much longer than that, and we do use some data from after July 2003 to try and make our point. There are around 25 armed groups involved, around just under 4 million deaths and 2 million displaced. So big figures. It was a lot of violence, big conflict. This is kind of just the map of the different sides. So the basic story of the conflict is this man on the left is called Laurent Désiré Kabila, and he overthrew the DRC government. Well, it wasn't the DRC government then. He overthrew the government in the First Congo War in '96, and with the help of Rwanda, became president of the DRC. Rwanda then wouldn't kind of go away, wouldn't leave him alone, wanted to ensure its interests were protected. He didn't like that, and that then led to the Second Congo War, which eventually brought in all these different countries through his diplomatic efforts. He was then assassinated in 2001 by what we think is a Rwandan plot, and his son, the man on the right, Joseph Kabila, took over, and he was much more successful in negotiating internationally and in securing peace, which was eventually secured at the end of 2002. So the question we're left asking after Maya, and what we're going to explore in this case study, is that we have a theory and wealth of data to show the negative impact of civil war on investment. So how do we explain Maya's findings? How do we make sense of it? Well, we're looking at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the first thing we see is the relationship between the FDI and this is FDI into the DRC, and the relationship does hold, and we see during the years of conflict, FDI does actually increase, and quite steeply afterwards in the years after as well. So how do we kind of make sense of this? Well, the first thing we really want to argue is that this relationship is very dependent on the sector, whether it's the primary sector, the secondary sector, or the tertiary sector. And we're arguing that during times of conflict, FDI into the primary sector is much more stable and can increase, whereas in the secondary and tertiary, it's not the same. And the two papers under the first bullet point show as much. The second one as well, I want to just highlight, is interesting. It found that civil war and terrorism risks are positively associated with US investment in oil and gas, in US FDI in oil and gas. So it's clear that, yeah, in the primary sector, FDI can still occur during times of conflict. And to explain this, well, in the primary sector and these big primary sector industries, you have high barriers to exit. You have a lot of, well, first of all, you're kind of a lot of the time bound by geography or natural resources, and you're stuck in one place, and you have a lot of kind of expensive physical capital that is pretty hard to move. You can't just ship it from A to B like that. At the same time, this heavy physical capital is non-lootable, so it's more protected than other business assets, and so there's less of a risk of rebel groups or militias kind of seizing these assets. The political instability in a country reduces the likelihood of the state seizing these big MNCs, multinational corporations' assets. During times of conflict, or when conflict seems like it's about to happen, big companies have the incentive to get as much of resource X, normally out of the ground, as possible. And so they're going to increase investment in this time. And finally, violence may lead to new ownership of resources, particularly with land or natural resources, as existing owners are displaced, or the chaos kind of brings about an opportunity. This is kind of a big idea with the war economies. kind of topic is, yeah, chaos is and violence is as much an opportunity as anything else. And this argument is supported by these two graphs, where we see that resource-rich, afflicted, and fragile states receive the majority of FDI. We use resource-rich as a proxy for economies or countries with big primary sectors. The two normally go hand in hand. And then on the right-hand side, we see greenfield cross-border investment flows to CAF countries by sector, and largely in the primary sector. Greenfield investments are just a particular form of FDI. But still, it paints a clear picture of the primary sector being a big factor in why FDI still flows into conflict-afflicted areas. Finally, I just want to link the case of the DRC back to Maya, and these first two bullet points. We see that what was explained earlier, the displacement effect and low labor costs, how these contribute to FDI continuing in conflict-ridden times. These both occur. DRC fits these conditions well, so kind of matching the theoretical explanation or the explanation of Maya. And then to add to that, the extractive industry is not affected by big demand shocks, and the concentration of assets in the primary sector make them easier to secure. So these are other factors for explaining why we saw an increase of FDI into the DRC, potentially explaining why we saw an increase of FDI into the DRC during the Second Congo War. Now we want to focus on the mining industry. And the reason why I do this is because Mayer's argument, it actually goes further than just explaining why FDI could happen. He's saying that it's not in spite of conflict that FDI still occurs. It can actually be because of the conflict. So for the DRC, we want to link increased FDI to the conflict somehow. We want to show how they're somehow related. And the sector we use to do this is mining. It's incredibly important in the Second Congo War. It's got a strong relationship, association with violence and with conflict. And yeah, this graph is pretty interesting actually. And mining is pretty much the only industry where investments increase or stay positive during or in a conflict-afflicted country. So there's definitely this link between mining and conflict and war economies. It's important, and we see that focusing on the right-hand graph, FDI in mining did increase towards the end of the Civil War and the years after, where must remember conflict was still very prevalent, around 1,000 deaths a day in 2004. And we can see that there's still, despite this conflict, mining is still attracting this FDI. And this is really a story of exploitation and corruption, we are arguing. And there are clear signs of corruption in the mining sector during the transition period and towards the end of the Civil War. You can say the interests of the DRC state were not protected, and in many contracts it was a minority stakeholder. For example, in one contract for one particular mine, it was a contract with two other international companies, and the DRC state mining company had a 15% stake. So yeah, we can really see the effect of these international companies in the mining industry. If this FDI that we see, it's really kind of international investment starting to, at least in particular cases, dominate particular mines and really kind of get a grasp on the mining industry in the Congo kind of towards the end of the conflict and the official end of the Civil War. This combined with the fact that there was no mechanism for ensuring that private companies had actually adhere to the contracts, kind of combines with the first point, and you can start to see the picture of corruption that occurs in the DRC. And finally, during the Second Congo War, Rwanda and Uganda participated in mass-scale looting of the DRC's mineral resources and mines. And there's a knock-on effect to this, as companies were set up to facilitate with this mass-scale looting, set up in Rwanda and Uganda. And international mining companies would have been complicit in this by trading in mineral supplies, minerals and resources that have flowed to Rwanda and Uganda illegally. So it's important to know that when we talk about FDI, and international companies exploiting the DRC, it's not just necessarily Western companies. It's also other companies set up in Africa, in Rwanda and Uganda, that basically just stole this these resources and used them for their own benefit. And finally, yeah, so we've talked about the relationship in this presentation. We talked about the relationship between FDI and conflict, and we've argued for the importance the primary sector has a role to play in that. And we focused on the mining sector in the DRC and saw that even during this time of conflict, the mining sector was seeing increases in FDI, and it's really a story of exploitation and corruption. And in this sense, there is very much a link between the FDI into the mining sector and the violence that occurred. But the question we then want to ask is, which comes first, the investment or the conflict? For Maya, the conflict created the conditions for the investment, but you could perhaps argue with certain cases in the DRC, the international investment, the international trade that occurred in the mining industry actually reproduced some of the conflict. And this is kind of the central thing with war economies, this reproduction of conflict economies and of wealth based on exploitation and conflict. One paper we found when researching found that in states with a low regard for civil liberties or with unhealthy economies, increased access to investment is associated with a high number of conflict actions by the state. So a state that is receiving FDI then wants to kind of secure this investment and really locks down on its investment and tries to securitize it through conflict, through repression of militia. So this is just one way, and this is something I think we should think about in the discussion, is one way in how investment and foreign investment can actually lead to an increase in conflict, as opposed to just Maya's argument of conflict creating the conditions for investment. So this is something to think about in the discussion questions.